7 decades since the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, around 80 new fragments of the ancient texts have been revealed to the public.
In 2021, archaeologists undertook a perilous journey into a desert cave, untouched for over 6 decades. They didn't just retrieve ancient relics, they unearthed forgotten narratives, threads of history intricately woven with human struggle and profound belief. This is by far first place. "It's the most amazing thing I encountered, I found, I seen in my life," remarked one of the lead archaeologists. What they brought back, written in Greek, marked in Hebrew, and hidden in plain sight, would challenge established historical and religious understandings. With the help of advanced AI, including cutting-edge tools, these fragile scraps from a longer scroll, containing translations of the 12 minor prophets into Greek, were reassembled, translated, and analyzed. The revelations were profound. AI had decoded the Dead Sea Scrolls, and the implications were far-reaching, even unsettling. The long silence had finally lifted, the secrets were out, and for many who had built their certainty on what they believed could never change, the very foundations seemed to tremble. In 2021, after more than 6 decades of silence, archaeologists made a historic and harrowing return to one of the Judean desert's most chilling sites, the Cave of Horror. This remote cavern, perched precariously high on a limestone cliff, had long resisted extensive exploration. Shrouded in dust and perpetual shadow, its perilous access and grim history deterred even the most seasoned explorers. Under the leadership of Oren Abelman, the Israel Antiquities Authority's Dead Sea Scrolls expert, a specially trained team embarked on a descent that tested their limits. They rappelled down the sheer cliff face by ropes, navigating treacherous drops that seemed to vanish into darkness. Loose stones fell without warning, and every step demanded absolute concentration. Abelman, candid about the experience, admitted, "Personally, it's one of the only caves I do not want to go into. I'll leave that to the expert rappellers." He described it as one of the most intimidating places I have ever faced, a journey that was as much a psychological challenge as a physical one. It was a place where ancient tragedy still felt palpable, he added with a note of unease. This is one cave where the silence weighs heavily. The cave's ominous name is not merely metaphorical, it stems from its dark history. During the original 1960s excavation, archaeologists discovered nearly 40 human skeletons huddled within its cramped chambers. These remains were identified as Jewish refugees caught in the catastrophic Bar Kokhba revolt against Roman imperial forces nearly 2,000 years ago. This is known as the Cave of Horror, named after 40 skeletons were found here 60 years ago, recounted Abelman. The grim discovery told a harrowing story of desperate siege and hopeless captivity. Trapped within this natural fortress, the rebels faced starvation and eventual death. Their final moments were etched into the cold stone walls of the cave, a silent testament to a people cornered and vanishing under brutal oppression. For them, it wasn't just a strategic failure, it was the definitive end. No rescue, no escape, just an overwhelming silence. "It's over," the cave seemed to whisper, not as a conclusion, but as a chilling verdict echoed across centuries. Some archaeologists speculate that the tableau inside was not merely a hiding place but a final, tragic stand. Yet, the 2021 expedition revealed something far more astonishing than human remains. Amidst layers of dust and centuries of debris, the team uncovered fragments of parchment, some smaller than a postage stamp, their edges frayed and text barely visible. These were no ordinary scraps. Abelman described them as microscopic windows into a lost past, delicate yet immensely significant. As these fragments were painstakingly matched and digitally enhanced, a disturbing and unexpected pattern emerged. The texts appeared to incorporate a hybrid script, part ancient Hebrew, part Greek, and interspersed with enigmatic symbols not fully recognized by current epigraphic catalogs. "We're here where we discovered for the first time in over 50 years new fragments of biblical texts for the Dead Sea region," announced Abelman. Some scholars cautiously speculated that these might be early forms of coded script or symbolic encryption, possibly used by the Bar Kokhba rebels or their contemporaries to transmit sensitive messages under the watchful eyes of Roman patrols. Abelman remarked, "The more we uncovered, the more it felt like these scrolls were more than mere religious or literary artifacts. They might have served as tools of resistance, documents layered with hidden meaning meant to preserve knowledge while eluding imperial censorship." The fragments revealed not just biblical passages, but hints at apocalyptic warnings, coded prophecies, and possibly ritualistic instructions that could redefine our understanding of the ideological landscape during that tumultuous period. For the first time in decades, the Cave of Horror began to whisper new secrets. Secrets that challenged established narratives and beckoned scholars to reconsider the complex interplay of faith, politics, and survival in one of history's most volatile eras. The fragments recovered from the Cave of Horror were astonishingly small. What we found is new fragments of a scroll that we have known before that had been discovered in the 1950s and early 1960s, Abelman explained, describing them as tiny scraps, some scarcely larger than a thumbnail. Their delicate fibers had become fragile after centuries of exposure to the harsh desert environment, yet, within these minuscule pieces lay an immense trove of information, patiently waiting to be unearthed and understood. Scholars and conservators embarked on an exhaustive process of reconstruction, employing advanced imaging technologies such as multispectral photography and digital stitching to identify matching pieces and restore legible text. What emerged was a puzzling mosaic of ancient scripture. Some fragments contained verses from Zechariah 8, a prophetic vision of restoration and hope, while others included a striking passage from Nahum 1 verse 5. The mountains quake before him and the hills melt away. This vivid apocalyptic imagery resonated deeply within the context of the Roman-era turmoil surrounding the cave's original occupants, yet, it wasn't just the content of the verses that drew attention, it was their linguistic form. Unlike the majority of Dead Sea Scrolls, which were traditionally written in Hebrew or Aramaic, these newly found texts were primarily rendered in Greek, the lingua franca of the Eastern Mediterranean during that period. This presented a remarkable anomaly, challenging long-held assumptions about the cultural and religious milieu of the scroll's creators. Adding to the intrigue, the divine name of God, the Tetragrammaton, was preserved not in Greek but in the ancient Hebrew script, punctuating the text with a deliberate and reverent reminder of sacred tradition. This deliberate bilingual layering suggested a complex cultural interplay. The scrolls were not merely translations, but symbolic bridges, blending the old with the new, the sacred with the common, and the Hebrew religious identity with the Hellenistic world surrounding them. This fusion hinted at a community navigating the turbulent currents of faith and identity, clinging to tradition while simultaneously adapting to broader cultural influences. Each fragment was a whisper from a people caught at the crossroads of history, their messages encoded in language that transcended simple communication to assert something profoundly spiritual. Building on this linguistic surprise, scholars at the Israel Antiquities Authority discovered that the Greek text was a non-Septuagint version of the Hebrew Bible, a significant deviation from the traditional Greek translation widely accepted among Hellenistic Jewish communities since the 3rd century BCE. Rather than a straightforward translation, this version appeared editorialized, restructuring and rewording scripture, particularly in the books of the 12 minor prophets, including Nahum and Zechariah. Subtle shifts in tone and phrasing stood out. Linguists identified mirrored syntactic structures and repetitive phraseology uncommon in direct translation, indicating a fresh interpretive approach tailored for a distinct audience. One striking feature remained constant: the divine name of God was uniquely rendered in ancient Paleo-Hebrew script, preserved almost reverently within a sea of Greek prose. This intentional bilingual juxtaposition pointed to a community balancing sacred tradition with cultural adaptation. The implications are profound. Were these scrolls created by diaspora Jews who had adopted Greek while maintaining their Hebrew heritage, or were they the product of more insular sects, such as the Essenes or early proto-Christian groups, engaging in theological reinvention amid shifting religious landscapes? What began as a mere scribal artifact now appeared as something far more intentional, a theological crossroads encoded in parchment. The scrolls were not simply vessels of preserved belief, they were instruments of reinvention, and through their dual language structure, they spoke of a world in religious flux, where cultural hybridity was not a threat, but a means of survival. As archaeologists meticulously sifted through the layers of sediment within the Cave of Horror, they stumbled upon something utterly unexpected: not text, not tools, but a vessel. It was a woven basket, entirely intact, tucked away in the corner of a small alcove deep inside the cave. This is by far first place. It's the most amazing thing I encountered, I seen in my life, the biggest intact basket, the oldest intact basket that we know of," exclaimed Abelman, measuring over 2 feet in height. It was sealed with a flat lid and buried in a layer that radiocarbon dating later revealed to be over 10,500 years old. "It looks completely new," Abelman said, "but it turned out to be 10,500 years old, which makes it, to the best of our knowledge, the oldest complete basket ever discovered anywhere in the world." To put that in perspective, this basket predated the Dead Sea Scrolls by nearly 8,000 years. It was crafted before the emergence of writing systems, before the wheel, even before the invention of ceramics. It belonged to the Neolithic era, a time when early humans were still transitioning from nomadic hunter-gatherers to settled agriculturalists, and somehow, across 10 millennia, it had survived, its intricate weave preserved by the uniquely dry climate of the Judean desert. The basket was empty, but its very existence posed a haunting question: why was it there? And who had placed it? Anthropologists speculated that the cave had long served as a refuge, not just for the Jewish rebels of the Bar Kokhba revolt or the scribes of ancient scripture, but for people in prehistoric times who sought shelter from predators, climate extremes, or even intertribal conflict. The location's harsh inaccessibility may have been its primary draw. It was a place people turned to not when life was easy, but when survival depended on secrecy and isolation. The basket's preservation in the same stratigraphy as the scrolls, yet from such a radically different time, suggested something deeper. This wasn't merely a cave of rebels or scholars, it was a layered monument to human perseverance. A site of repeated return, a space where fear, hope, and belief had collided for millennia. Archaeologists began to reconsider the cave not just as a historical site but as a temporal palimpsest, a place inscribed again and again by generations who never knew one another yet responded to the same existential needs. From Stone Age survivors to Roman-era dissidents, the Cave of Horror was not just a backdrop to history, it was history's witness. The fragments recovered from the Cave of Horror were not just historical relics, they were intricate puzzles, torn, crumbled, and darkened by nearly 2,000 years of time. Many were no larger than a fingernail. Traditional conservation methods had their limits, so in a bold convergence of ancient history and cutting-edge innovation, researchers turned to artificial intelligence. This wasn't a quest for divine secrets or cryptic prophecy, it was a meticulous act of digital resurrection. First, every fragment was scanned in high resolution under various spectrums of light, visible, infrared, and ultraviolet, to reveal faint, nearly invisible traces of ink. Optical character recognition, OCR, software, enhanced with machine learning algorithms trained specifically on ancient Biblical Greek and early Hebrew scripts, began the painstaking process of transcribing the text's character by faded character, but that was only the beginning. Once digitized, deep learning systems, fed with a vast corpus of known scrolls, ancient manuscripts, and epigraphic patterns, began reconstructing not just text, but context. They compared the fragments across multiple sources and timelines, detecting stylistic consistencies in handwriting and scroll layout that had eluded human detection for decades. What emerged was not mysticism, but methodology. AI didn't reveal prophecy, it revealed people, scribes with identifiable strokes, standardized practices, and regional peculiarities. Certain scrolls shared not only linguistic structure but also ink composition, papyrus preparation techniques, and stitching patterns. These clues pointed to shared workshops or scriptoria where trained scribes labored to produce scrolls in a controlled, almost industrial fashion. It suggested that within these isolated desert communities, there had existed a surprising level of organizational sophistication, a structured scribal tradition designed to preserve sacred writings across generations, even in times of persecution. And it was the AI, not the human eye, that first detected the overlapping identities encoded in the script itself. But not all scrolls bore the quiet signature of institutional preservation. Some of the fragments, particularly those written in Greek, told a far more desperate story. Dated through radiocarbon testing and paleographic analysis, these scrolls definitively belong to the era of the Bar Kokhba revolt, a failed but fierce Jewish uprising against the Roman Empire between 132 and 136 CE. The Cave of Horror, where they were found, was not a library, it was a tomb. Historical accounts tell us that during the revolt, entire families fled into the Judean cliffs, hiding in nearly inaccessible caves to escape Roman retaliation. This is known as the Cave of Horror, named after 40 skeletons were found here 60 years ago, as previously noted. The caves offered shelter, but no escape. Archaeologists in the 1960s had already uncovered nearly 40 skeletons within the cave, men, women, and children curled against the rock, many with signs of starvation and trauma. It wasn't a peaceful passing, it was a siege without soldiers, a surrender sealed by silence. The newly recovered scrolls were found scattered, not carefully stored in jars like the more famous Qumran texts, but wrapped in cloth and wedged into tight recesses of stone, likely in the final hours before death. The texts they carried were not ceremonial artifacts meant for ritual display. They were personal, portable, sacred fragments, perhaps hastily taken from homes as the Roman advance closed in, perhaps the last spiritual defense against an empire that seemed unstoppable, and this changes how we see them. These scrolls were not buried with the hope of future discovery, they were carried in fear, gripped with urgency, and hidden not for preservation, but for salvation. They were not meant for scholars, they were meant for God. In this light, the very presence of the fragments becomes a kind of echo, not just of a faith, but of a people's final cry, unheard for nearly 2 millennia until technology gave it voice again. With the aid of multispectral imaging and machine learning algorithms, paleographers began noticing something extraordinary beyond the legible words in ancient languages. They uncovered the unmistakable imprint of individuality. AI wasn't just reading the text, it was identifying the hand that wrote it. Subtle distinctions in the shape of a dalet, the slant of an aleph, or the pressure behind a final nun, revealed a catalogue of personal quirks. Like a fingerprint pressed in ink and stretched across millennia, each scribe's unique style was exposed. One fragment stood out, a portion of the Book of Nahum. It contained jagged lines, irregular ink flow, and characters that leaned too far forward or slumped slightly downward. To the naked eye, it might look like rushed writing, but AI analysis told a different story. Microvibrations in the line work indicated tremors. Either the writer was elderly, ill, or writing under immense psychological duress, perhaps even while in hiding. The passage itself was ominous. The Lord will not leave the guilty unpunished. Was this a theological cry in the dark, a quiet act of rebellion, or simply a copied verse in a time of collapse? Suddenly, the Dead Sea Scrolls were not only scripture or archaeological data, they were the closest thing we have to diaries written in exile, echoes of mortal hands shaking in fear or faith, recording words as the world around them crumbled. Linguistic and material diversity across the scroll sites has always puzzled scholars, but when AI models began mapping the scroll's linguistic patterns and material origins, tracing ink chemistry, parchment type, and script style, a deeper network began to emerge. The fragments were written in Biblical Hebrew, Aramaic, Greek, and even in the archaic Paleo-Hebrew, once reserved for sacred names. They were hidden not just in Qumran, but scattered throughout the Judean desert, from the cave of Horror to Wadi Murabat. The variety suggested more than one community, yet within this diversity, a surprising consistency held firm, a reverence for scripture, a systematic approach to copying, and a desperation to preserve. Some of the scrolls showed careful corrections, re-inking, and marginal annotations. Others were hastily sewn together from smaller fragments, bound with ancient thread. All of them bore signs of motion, being transported, hidden, even buried alongside the dead. This wasn't the product of one isolated sect, it was the output of a vast and decentralized underground movement. Many still adhere to the Essene hypothesis, that an apocalyptic sect at Qumran was responsible for the scrolls, and yet, new digital analysis suggests otherwise. Textual variants not found in Qumran were discovered among the newer Cave of Horror fragments, aligning more closely with Jewish communities from Jerusalem and the Galilee. It implies that the scrolls were compiled from multiple sources, possibly during the escalating Roman crackdowns following the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE. If so, the scrolls represent not just religious devotion, but a cultural rescue mission, a hurried effort to preserve a collapsing world's intellectual legacy. A chain of scribes, runners, refugees, and faithful caretakers passed these texts across time and geography, racing against war, fire, and extinction. And now, through AI and archaeology, we are finally beginning to understand the scale of what they tried to save. As AI-assisted imaging and sophisticated linguistic modeling pushed the boundaries of restoration, the scroll fragments began to reveal more than just ancient text. They exposed the silences carved into scripture itself. At first, These gaps seemed like ordinary damage, rips, decay, and lost fibers that erased words and sentences, yet, patterns emerged that were far too consistent and deliberate to be dismissed as mere accident. Entire canonical books were systematically missing from the collection. The Book of Esther, renowned for its dramatic story of survival and providence within the Hebrew Bible, was utterly absent. As if deliberately excluded, equally perplexing was the total lack of the books of Chronicles. Crucial for tracing genealogies central to priestly authority and royal legitimacy, other texts frequently cited in early Jewish liturgy were similarly missing or reduced to mere fragments. Even more disturbing was how the reconstructed Greek fragments defied expectations. Initially believed to be variants of the Septuagint, the ancient Greek translation of Hebrew scriptures, they contained passages strikingly alien to any known biblical tradition. Some verses referenced enigmatic figures and cryptic events absent from the entire biblical corpus, while others subtly reframed the tone of commandments, shifting emphasis from divine mandate to communal consensus. Several texts appeared to elevate communal rituals over centralized temple worship, perhaps suggesting dissenting sects that challenged the priesthood's monopoly. Messianic prophecies, a cornerstone of later Jewish and Christian belief, were conspicuously muted or reinterpreted, sometimes replaced by apocalyptic warnings focused on collective ethical responsibility rather than individual salvation. The AI's meticulous cross-textual analysis decisively ruled out simple scribal error or accidental corruption. What it uncovered was deliberate redaction, an ongoing process of inclusion, exclusion, and rewriting by successive hands. Through careful forensic examination of handwriting styles, ink composition, and linguistic rhythm, distinct sectarian signatures surfaced. These weren't the uniform works of a single cohesive community, but a complex palimpsest of theological factions, each reshaping sacred texts to affirm its own ideology, authority, and eschatological vision. This fractured mosaic forced a radical reconsideration. The scriptures preserved in the Dead Sea Scrolls were not a fixed, divinely dictated canon, but a contested, evolving archive, a battleground where competing visions of faith, law, and destiny clashed and intertwined. And a good portion of the documents are given over to biblical scrolls. We use the word biblical here cautiously because the Bible as a concept didn't exist at the time, Abelman clarified. If this was true, then the Bible as we know it was never a monolithic divine revelation, but a dynamic, negotiable document shaped as much by human ambition, politics, and survival as by spirituality. These manipulations were profound, not superficial footnotes. They suggested that the sacred text itself had always functioned as a mirror, reflecting the ambitions and anxieties of those who wielded it. When the AI-driven reconstruction reached its final stages, drawing upon an unprecedented database of biblical manuscripts from the Masoretic text and Septuagint to the Samaritan Pentateuch and beyond, the results were quietly delivered to a select group of historians, linguists, and paleographers. Their reactions ranged from astonishment to profound unease. The scrolls did more than simply diverge from the modern Bible, they shook its very foundations. Linguistic discrepancies were mere surface phenomena compared to the seismic theological ruptures beneath. Entire commandments central to contemporary religious life were missing. Others were repositioned from divine decree to human counsel. Historical sequences fractured, with patriarchs appearing out of canonical order, and ritual observances either marginalized or erased entirely. More unsettling was the evidence that early Judaism was not a unified faith, but a sprawling tapestry of competing doctrines. Conflicting interpretations of the law abounded. Notions of God's nature varied dramatically, from transcendent monotheism to cosmic dualism, some alternate creation. Accounts reframed the universe's origin not as a singular divine act, but as the aftermath of celestial conflict between rival powers, a narrative echoing themes later condemned as heresy. This was not a revelation of a secret conspiracy, but a window into centuries of religious evolution shaped by shifting social dynamics, power struggles, and institutional imperatives. The sacred scriptures were hammered, polished, and recast through generations, shaped as much by human hands and agendas as by any transcendent authority. Critically, these insights derived from the oldest extant biblical manuscripts, the Dead Sea Scrolls themselves. For decades, scholars had presumed these scrolls validated the biblical canon's reliability. Instead, they unveiled a far messier, far more human story. One where sacredness was not intrinsic, but imposed, negotiated, and Contested, the scholarly consensus that began to form was stark. What we accept as biblical truth is not an untouched divine record, but the end product of rigorous selection, revision, and erasure, a religious text shaped by historical contingency and ideological conflict. This realization was not merely academic, it struck at the heart of faith traditions, challenging foundational beliefs about Scripture's nature, origin, and authority. It demanded a new humility and openness in how sacred texts are understood, acknowledging their living, breathing history rather than idealizing them as immutable. The implications are staggering and, for many, profoundly unsettling. It's worse than we thought. If you had to choose one thing to preserve for future generations, knowing what we now understand about the evolution of human knowledge and belief, what would it be? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for watching this video with us and catch you in the next one.